Hello and welcome to another edition of Everything's Photography. Today, as promised, I'm going to be discussing ISO. What is ISO? Why do we use ISO? What does it do for our photography? Okay, well, in the last two videos, I hope you watched them both. The first video we covered what is shutter speed. The second video we covered what is aperture. Two really big things for the exposure triangle, and the final thing for the exposure triangle is ISO, and that would make up the full triangle. Now, what does ISO do? Well, nothing really. You don't use it for anything creative, like you would use shutter speed for motion, you would use aperture for depth of field. ISO really is just a backup for one of those two. So what does it do? Well, it allows your sensor to be more or less sensitive. So it's the light that's hitting your sensor and how sensitive your actual camera is. Now, for example, if I'm taking a photograph of, and I've used this analogy before, if I'm taking a photograph of the dog outside and the dog's moving around really fast, and I've got my aperture right down, and it's down as low as I can get my aperture, so that's letting in tons and tons of light. I've got my ISO set at 100 because we want to try and keep that down, but my camera's telling me I need to have my shutter speed on really low, 1/60. So when I take a photograph of the dog, I actually get motion blur. So here's where ISO comes into play. I can now turn my ISO up to, say, 400 instead of 100, which means I can now move my shutter speed up. If I can move my shutter speed up, I'm going to get a sharper shot of the dog running around in the backyard. Because in the last video, as we discussed, the faster your shutter speed, the more detail you get in motion. The lower the shutter speed, obviously, the opposite is true. Now, so let's do another analogy. Let's say I want everything in my shot to be absolutely perfect. I want it to be in focus. So what I would need to do in order to have everything in focus is I would need to bring up my aperture, like we discussed in another video. So let's say I've got my aperture up to 1/22. Let's say we're at f-stop 22. I've got my shutter speed on really low. It's quite low. I mean, I'm at 1/10. I've got it on a tripod. I just need some more light. So in that situation, I can bring up my ISO. That'll give me a bit more light. I can probably bring up my my shutter speed a little bit with that as well, and that'll help. That'll help with the accuracy of the shot, and everything will be nicely in focus. So if I'm out in the evening and the sun's going down, it's really light, I'm taking a photograph of a friend, they're not exactly standing still, we're outside a bar or something, so because I need to get them in shot, I need my shutter speed to be quite high. So I'm not gonna get any motion blur in what they're doing. I want a shallow depth of field because I don't really care about. I want them to be the main topic of the picture. So I want the background to be quite blurry. So I've got a shallow depth of field. I've got my aperture down as far as it'll go. And my shots, they're too dark. They're just too dark. So in that situation, again, I can bring my ISO up. That'll make the sensor in the camera more sensitive to light, and I'll get that great shot that I want. . Now there is a downside to this. And it happens in a different place on different cameras. I guess it's whether you've got a cheaper camera or a more expensive camera. It will always happen in a different place. If you've got your ISO up too much, then that'll be oversensitive on the sensor of your camera, and then you'll start getting that grainy effect. You know, when you see like an old photograph from the 1920s and you get that almost snow on the picture, a grainy effect. That's noise. That's called noise, and that comes with having your ISO up too high. So a general rule of thumb to get a nice clean photo is you want your ISO to be down as low as you possibly can. This is why in every video that I've done so far, I've said that your ISO needs to be, in my opinion, the last thing that you touch. So if I'm shooting something that's moving fast, I set my shutter speed first. Then I decide what shallow field I want. Do I want the background to be in focus? Do I want it to be out of focus? Then I'll set my aperture, and then I'll look at my shots. And if I always keep my ISO on 100, and then from there, once I've set my shutter speed and my aperture, I look at my shot and I say, right, I could do with that being a bit lighter. So with that, I would crank up my ISO. Now, if I'm taking a picture of a landscape, for example, and I want everything to be in focus, then the first thing I would set is my aperture. It doesn't really matter about my shutter speed. Well, that could be on a low shutter speed because I haven't got any moving objects. So I can then put my shutter speed on a low shutter speed to let in as much light as I can, keeping my ISO on 100. If I get my shutter speed down to as low as I personally want it, then I'll take a shot and I'll have a look. If it's too dark, where do I go? My ISO. I crank up my ISO. So it's always the last thing that I do on the exposure triangle. So basically, in a nutshell, your ISO is the sensitivity of your sensor that's inside your camera. So your shutter speed will let light in. If it's a slow shutter speed, it will let more light in than a faster shutter speed. Your aperture will, as we discussed, is the hole inside your camera. So if that's rear closed, that's not going to let so much light in. If it's open, it's going to let more light in. Whereas your ISO is how sensitive your camera actually is to that light. So ISO, high ISO 3200 is going to be really sensitive, but you could end up with a grain effect. So, and a really low ISO is going to be not so sensitive in your camera, and that's going to give you cleaner, sharper shots. So I hope I've covered that really well. This is my third video. The next video will be putting the full exposure triangle together, and then we'll be moving on to different things after that. I hope you've enjoyed my videos. If you do, please subscribe, please share, please send me a like. It's giving you a lot of work to do, isn't it? And look forward to my next video next week, because I should be posting one a week. So I hope I've inspired you for your photography. Get out there, take some great photographs, enjoy what you're doing. That's all it's about. Please remember, you're not taking photographs for everybody's pleasure, you're taking it for your own. Thank you very much.